So yes, my role at the State Library of Queensland is the Director of Content Management. So I look after the teams that do the selection and acquisition, cataloguing, digitisation, preservation and conservation, and the collection management, people who look after the material in the repositories. So I have an awesomely amazing staff who work with me. But today I'm going to be talking about a project that the State Library of Queensland began in 2014, which was called QANZAC100 Memories for a New Generation. And it was a World War I centenary of commemoration project. And I stand here at the end of what appears to be an extremely long war. For those of us who've been working in this space, one that's had many ebbs and flows, with a great flurry of activity in 2015, and then a loss of interest because it was a very long war, and now an increasing interest from 2017 with the centenary of America entering the war, and now as we come to the last year and begin to address issues such as the impact of the Spanish flu epidemic and the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux and the closing out stages of the war and the impact when soldiers came home. So I'm just going to talk you through a little bit about the project, but then raise some of the issues that we had. I think the benefit for us at an event like this, you can read in much more detail about what we have done in the paper, is to actually sort of pose those questions that help us think, well, what did we learn and what could we learn, and how could that be applied both by my institution and by other organisations when undertaking these very long and significant projects. We did get a large amount of funding. It was one of three projects funded in Queensland. One of them was the restoration of Anzac Square by Brisbane City Council, and the other was the Queensland Museum development of a permanent World War I exhibition. And coincidentally, this morning, the Mephisto tank is actually being placed in situ, I think, in the early hours of this morning. So for people who are unaware, we have this German tank that got off, it was a, what are they called, a war prize, and it's the only left German tank in the entire world of this particular class. And Queensland was very, what's the word, enterprising, and that as the ship came back, they took it off the boat at Brisbane so that it wouldn't make its way to New South Wales or to Melbourne. And so that explains why Queensland Museum has the Mephisto tank. Just going to move my notes over here so I can see. So these three projects were funded by the Queensland Government as part of the World War I centenary commemorations, which, as you know, it's not without controversy, and so it's been something that has been worthwhile considering, not only in terms of the funding that's been allocated, and the funding allocated in Australia for commemorative activities was more than the funding for New Zealand, Canada, the UK, France and Germany combined. So it was something that was given a great deal of public attention here, but also I think not only because of that money, but also the primacy of the narrative around Australia's participation in that conflict as a nation-building experience in the birth of the Anzac legend. So SLQ had several aims in delivering our QANZAC100 Memories for a New Generation project, and they were around increasing understanding of Queenslanders' experiences during and after the war, to build the capacity of our community stakeholders to explore and share local and family stories, to enable researchers to access content, to explore the centenary of how the centenary was itself commemorated, and importantly to encourage a re-examination of the past. So the focus was on building and shaping a digital legacy through acquiring and digitising material, developing and presenting exhibitions, funding and supporting community collections and engagement initiatives, commissioning digital stories and other works, and fostering research through a fellowship program and symposia. But underpinning these diverse activities has been the intent to sustain a digital legacy by considering the outputs of all of this as data, something that will live on, something that is more than a Mephisto tank or a refurbished Anzac Square. And so, as I alluded to earlier, although we'll be focusing in this paper and presentation on the digital legacy related to the First World War, I would suggest that this framework of building, shaping and sustaining could be applied in other contexts for local, state-based Australian or international projects related to commemorations. And in my mind at the moment is Cook in the 250th anniversary of sailing up the east coast of Australia in 2020, 50 years since the moon landing in 2019, and other themes that might be significant or controversial in our national conversation and open for re-examination. And as I said, it's been a long war and a long commemoration, but I hope there is some relevance and some useful takeaway ideas for you. So the State Library of Queensland has been collecting First World War diaries and letters and photographs and historically significant items since shortly after the opening of the Oxley Memorial Library in 1934, when content related to the First World War was made a priority for the benefit of future generations. So those two newspaper articles, one from 1934 and one from 1935, calling out to get material related to the First World War. There are a number of highly significant organisational records, such as the archives of the Queensland Recruiting Committee and the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee, and it's one of Queensland's distinctive things is that Anzac Day was first conceived in Queensland. Most of our collection, however, is first-hand personal accounts and diaries, letters, photographs, and they provide a detailed and often quite intimate narrative of the service and participation. So the first thing we did was lots and lots of digitisation. We digitised collections of First World War material, and that was a major focus. To create a digital legacy, we needed to digitise. So up to date, there's probably been more than 35,000 original material items that have been digitised. So that's diaries, photographs, personal papers, objects and realia and maps. And in addition to that, more than 30,000 portraits of soldiers, which I'll talk to later. Despite the richness of those resources, we encountered bibliographic metadata that, to put it nicely, in some cases was thin, and particularly this was with our older collections that had been collected in the 1930s and 40s. So we really needed to do some work to increase access and discoverability of those collections, basic things like adding proper subject headings and uniform titles and material like that, that actually made it more accessible. We also acquired and digitised new collections through purchase and donation, and the aim was to provide a detailed record of Queensland military experience at home and overseas, and an in-depth picture of life for Queensland families and citizens who remained at home, one of the other distinctives of our project. We also introduced a digital-only option, which was designed to accommodate organisations or individuals who wanted to share their collections but maintained a strong attachment to the physical object, and they just weren't willing to donate them or make them available for purchase. By offering this option where they loaned them to us, we digitised them and then we gave them back, we could still acquire content and make it discoverable, accessible and able to be preserved in a digital form. And you can see on this image here, there are some of the collections that we have. The elderly lady in the bottom right corner, her name is Margaret Thorsborn, and her parents both served in World War I and coincidentally married after the war. And there's a digital story taken with her where she reminisces about her parents' experience of the war. So now we move on to the idea of shaping a digital legacy. So you have lots and lots and lots of content. What do you do with it? It requires understanding the context around that collection material, making connections across the collections, and collaborating with others to discover new news, new knowledge, and to uncover meaning that we may not have previously known. Exhibitions are one way to do that, to shape that legacy around participation. because an exhibition and an allied events program has the capacity to draw people together, to tell the story, and to actually ask questions about what we know and what we might have thought about the First World War. We did 2 major exhibitions. One was called Distant Lines, and the other one was called Peace and Quiet. And there were a series of smaller exhibitions in our library's Treasures Wall that have been refreshed annually over the commemorative period. We drew from our collection's strengths and encouraged curation across a wide range of wartime experiences. But the project also funded and supported community collecting and engagement initiatives with a particular focus on community collaboration, where I actually think the gold lay. We provided 10 $10,000 community grants, which were amazing amounts of money for small projects in libraries, schools, archives and organisations across the state that had to be delivered via the History Pin platform to connect communities with their local history and the stories of the First World War. What came out of that was an incredible engagement, thousands of pieces of digital content contributed by communities as they told their own stories in digital form. A couple I'll mention. One was called Black All to Battle and Back, which was around a VC winner, Ed Katowner, who lived in remote Queensland. We had a story about Miss Martha Burns, who was Queensland's first female dentist and had a connection with the war, and a fantastic project on Indigenous servicemen, stories and portraits of Indigenous Queensland soldiers. So each one of those involved a small community group getting together. They were required to collaborate with others. It couldn't just be done with a library or a historical society. They had to show in their application that they were going to develop with other parts of their community this shared story, and then have their project live on History Pin. We also created digital stories. 30 were commissioned to provide insight into our First World War collections, and also activities that were related to the project, always trying to get that idea of the contemporary understanding of how we commemorate, plus the historical understanding of what was in our collections. And finally, we had extensive regional events. You'll see some pictures there of conservation clinics and what we called white gloves tours. Top right corner, you can see one of our staff there with a collection item and his white cotton gloves, taking original materials and helping communities work out how to store and preserve and digitise and manage their own collections. And it wasn't about acquiring collections for us, it was about empowering communities to manage their own collections. So finally, we come on to looking at shaping a digital legacy. And this is where we start looking at data. So the data in these collections is very rich about people and places and events, and they're located in the collections of archives, galleries, museums, libraries, universities. Making connections between that data in disparate collections to further new knowledge and insight requires the data about the collections and the data within the collections to be made open and interoperable and able to be shared. Integrating data into the collections and services of collecting institutions is something that was stated in the vision of the British Library in their data strategy, which happened to pop up in mid-2017, and where they were saying we need to look at our collections as data because there is richness within them. And it really resonated with us because as we are progressing towards the end of this commemorative period, we're looking at what is the actual digital legacy. It's the data that is contained within those collections. But of course, as we know, this is where things may start to unravel a little bit, because I've talked quite optimistically about making connections between data in disparate collections and it's interoperable and everyone can share. And we know that that's actually not what happens. We sometimes are unable to make those connections. And I'm just going to examine that briefly through a project we did in digitising soldier portraits before I conclude by asking some questions about what we could do next. So Here we have a picture of a soldier portrait. Oh, no, I don't, because I haven't clicked my thing. Here we have a picture of T. O'Reilly, a First World War soldier. Just to give a little bit of context, in 1914 in September, just at the outbreak of the war, a photographic studio in Brisbane established a tent in the soldiers' enlistment camp at Enoggera in what was then the outer northern district of Brisbane. And the studio was there to take a photograph of every soldier in their kit for publication in the newspaper. This had been done during the Boer War, and they decided they'd do it again for First World War. It was in such high demand that other studios also set up a tent to capture the enlistees as they arrived. They were published in the pictorial supplement of the Queenslander newspaper, and so that everyone could see at the point of their embarkation what they were there. What the saddest thing when I was researching this, and I'm just going to read this little quote from the newspaper. The work of photographing members of the Expeditionary Force for the Queenslander is proceeding rapidly at the Talma Press studio tent in the infantry and artillery sections at Enoggera. In order to facilitate operations, a second press studio has been established in the Light Horse Lines by Mr. J. Fegan, and this is now in full swing. Uniforms are provided for those who have not yet been fitted out, so that every man's portrait will appear in official setting. Publication of the pictures will begin in the Queenslander as soon as sufficient photographs are in hand. It will be impossible for the whole number to appear in one issue, but they will be spread over as few weeks as possible. A number of interesting snapshots of the camp and its occupants at work and play have been secured and will be published in this week's Queenslander. It was 4 years before they finished putting in photographs of soldiers, and eventually there were 30,000 soldier portraits published in the Queenslander. So right up until 1918 they were still publishing them, and it's so sad to think that they thought it would all be done in a few weeks. They were also done so that they could be promptly published with casualty lists and honour rolls, and as a resource for family historians and researchers into the Queensland experience of the war, they're invaluable and particularly useful as they are all named, unlike many other collections of First World War soldiers. So they all have two initials, or one or two initials, and a last name. And this has been the thing that made them incredibly reusable. So what we did was to digitise them. You can see there how they appear in the Queenslander on Trove, digitised from microfilm. And of course, because the source microfilm was not of super high quality, it's actually they're quite indistinct. And because although this has changed since 2013, so in 2013, most of the captions were not recorded because the OCR layer hadn't been run over these pages of images, or else the quality of the OCR was very poor because it imitated handwriting. After we'd finished the digitising, this is what it looked like. An incredible increase in quality, and each individual portrait was extracted by, we had some volunteers who did that work because our staff couldn't do it, and an individual catalogue record created for each soldier. But now we see where we run into problems. There is no point of truth with data about people, and I don't think it matters whether it's World War I, World War II, Shakespeare, or the Iraq War. There actually is no point of truth, and getting to the point where we accepted we were never going to have a definitive point of truth, and that the data we were dealing with was actually quite dirty, and cleaning up was something that we could do in part, but we were never going to be able to complete. Here's an example. This is an Indigenous serviceman, Daniel Cabot, born at Borillam Station in Queensland, and he enlisted in Baramba. But you can see his name was annotated in the newspaper as D. Gabbo. And we find other variants of his names in other sources: Gabbo, Cobbo, Cabo and Cabby. So depending on whether you're looking in the newspaper, his birth certificate, the birth, deaths and marriages, the Australian War Memorial or the National Archives, you could have multiple variations of this person's name. So to actually let go of the fact that there's a point of truth and realise that to fully connect this person with all their records, you need to have all the variations of their name in our record, was a quite sobering fact. Then, of course, we have what I call the John Smith problem. J. Smith, J. Smith, J. Smith, J. Smith, J. Smith. There are many, 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 many J. Smiths, and we will never be able to connect them to which J. Smith belongs to which information. That's just one of the names, that there are many, many. T. Wilson is another one, but even McIntyre is a name that is quite difficult to find who is who. So we have messy data, where we have incorrect data, either through variations of name or poor transcription or bad hearing, or someone who used an alias to enlist. And then we've got data which is so similar we can't disaggregate it. When it works well, we get some wonderful connections, and I'm just showing you here two images of Lieutenant F.R. Smith, one from the War Memorial, one from our collection. And then we go on and we see his service record, a newspaper article, a photograph from another collection, and also some correspondence that he had written. So we start to build a really nice picture up of F.R. Smith, where we can find out quite a lot of detail about who he was, what were his emotions, what he did, what awards he won. He won a Distinguished Flying Cross, and to get something of his story. It works quite well in his case, but for most, it doesn't. What we're left with is collections that sit behind paywalls. We don't have APIs, so we find it very difficult to connect information that comes from one data source with connections with data in our data sources. And we don't have the capacity to actually do that problem solving to resolve the issues. It's a vexed problem. We used the National Archives API, which is throttled to only 2,000 results, so it made our lives very difficult. We eventually worked with the archives, and they ran API calls for us so we could make connections to the data. We used the Australian War Memorial API, which unfortunately appears to have disappeared from their website since they've gone to their new website, and that was extremely useful. So our soldier portraits data is actually quite rich, because included in our records we have links to the service record, we have links to their embarkation details, we have links to their National Archives personal identifier, which actually is a unique identifier for each serviceman in Australia. And we have lots of really good data about that, but it's only for that small part of our collection. So my question to you then is, what are we going to do next? How can we move linked data forwards to achieve what it always has promised? How can we move from a cottage industry to something that has real impact? How can we get beyond institutional protectiveness or low capacity for risk to make these things happen? My sad thought is that there was an enormous amount of money spent in this country on First World War commemorations. Yet at times it feels to me that a strong and enduring legacy with simple, meaningful connections between content and data is still very far away. And if we've spent this much money and we're not able to make as much progress as we might have thought, what are we going to do? My tips are, if you're going to embark upon a big project like this, start early. I wish we'd started in 2011, even though it would have made the war even longer, because we should have been digitising years before the centenary of commemoration started. So start early is my first tip. The next one is, in your planning, plan to share. Share your output, share your learning, share your content so that other people can use it as well. Push and push and push and push to get everyone talking together. If our national cultural institutions had talked more, the Australian Defence Force Academy, the National Archives and the Australian War Memorial, we may have had a unique URI for every serviceman and woman in this country by now, and we still don't. Let go of the need to be the one institution, the one project, the one person that drives it and can stand up and say, hurrah, we did this. Be the people that share. And finally, I think, again on that note, I firmly believe in these large and significant projects where engaging with community, engaging with other institutions and wanting to leave a digital legacy. To quote Spock, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Thanks very much.
Does anybody have any questions for Margaret? Well, I'm going to start with one, and actually, I suppose, builds on the questions that you've just asked us. Do you see a role for crowdsourcing in this sort of thing? Is this, and I suppose touching back on Colin's experiences with the help that the family and friends of the family were able to give with the Guild notebooks, would there be a way of saying, do you know this man? Can you tell us something about him? And opening it up to the relatives, if you like.
Yes, I think there is. I certainly know the State Library of South Australia had did that with some unidentified soldier portraits. They put them out on Flickr and said, help us identify these people. And there have been a few initiatives in Australia and in France that have done that. We certainly used volunteers and are still using volunteers to upload the portraits to the National Archives Discovering ANZAC website. They've done 11,000, they've got 4,000 to go. So yes, I absolutely think that engaging with communities and crowdsourcing in some of these types of activities it's critical to succeed. Not because we want to use them as digital slaves, which is something I'm very loath to say, let's get these people, like the robots, to do this work for us that's beneath us, but more because it actually is really quite engaging to bring people into the process. We've had a group of volunteers that have been transcribing newspaper articles, one newspaper article for every day of the war. So they started in 2013 and they'll be finished in a few months. So they've been working on that for about 5 years, and the engagement they have in finding a news story, transcribing it on Trove, and then they create them into Trove lists for us so that we can see newspaper articles of the day. If you were at the round table before, I think that's community building, using technology to build a community of people who are really interested and who come from very disparate backgrounds, but they just want to be involved with that. So in long answer, crowdsourcing works.